Exactly. This is a long presentation. I'm not going to take you through all many slides. It is available. If the slides will be available, if you want to access this afterwards, you can just ask the FASP if you're interested in that. Perhaps there are a few key messages. Then we can drill a little bit down in the detail. And my first key message to you is that we have seen, even very recently, very significant developments in this area. We've seen conceptual developments emanating, interestingly, importantly, from the ILO. I'll talk about that, because at least we need to have some understanding, even if only the understanding of what we're talking about leads us to the conclusion that this is a very complex, let's call it a sector for the moment, it's not really the right word, a very complex sector to define. And because it's difficult to define, it's also difficult how to regulate, if you like, how to provide institutionally. Nevertheless, this is a daunting task, we have to do it. Important conceptual developments and challenges, firstly. Secondly, there's very recent data available, just released, about the size, the context of the informal economy all over the world. It is alarming, and the figures for Africa in particular are alarming. Personally, I don't see that in the foreseeable future we're going to make a dent in those figures. We really have to look at how do we deal with these people who work in the informal economy. Then in the third instance, I want to focus a bit, and there's not much time, on the insufficiency of the current frameworks, the international standards framework, and also domestic systems. And it illustrates what, in particular, the Vice President said, there's really a need for proper reform, including legal reform. Then I want to say a few words about what I could call institutional reforms. And perhaps this is the most remarkable story that the world and the world of social protection has witnessed over the last 2 decades, that all over the developing world, governments have now taken up the responsibility to look at models as to how to meaningfully extend social protection to people who work in the informal economy. It is unprecedented, and may I say, as somebody who has worked in the area of social security and social protection for many years, I don't think ever in the history of the world have we seen such a rapid extension of coverage in the developing world to people who work in the informal economy, at least in terms of numbers. This is a story to be told and understood. The modalities are varied. There is no single model as to how to do this. This, I think, is critical for us. But there is also a way in how we achieve the purpose of extending coverage. We have to be careful how we do this. And I'll say a few words about that before eventually concluding. The case for enhanced protection. Let me read. And this is perhaps a major challenge that we all face, and governments as well. Concentrating attention on institutional reform, reforming that part of social security system, which covers only a small part of the labor force active in the formal labor market at the expense of those involved in non-traditional work and in the informal economy, I suggest to you, is inherently unequal, as it directs the attention of government and other stakeholders away from a huge segment of the population with no or little social security coverage. Unfortunately, this has been true, at least until recently, of most governments in the developing world, also been true of those who were supposed to give us guidance, development partners, international organizations, and the like. This is changing. This is a good news. I'm not going to waste time too much on the conceptual issues, but I want to suggest to you that we have seen a fundamental change in the conceptual framework. In fact, it is an ongoing change. It is as if, as we start to understand the informal economy better, that we need to understand, we need to adapt the framework, our conceptual framework, how we look at them and who they are. And perhaps we have to say this will keep on changing, for the very simple reason that the world of work is changing at a speed, at a pace that never was the case until now. We see this also in other areas. I'm also especially working in labor law. It's the same debate. How do we adjust the frontiers of labor law to take care of those who work in the informal economy? If there's time, I'll say a few more words about that. So, but essentially, while initially the term informal sector was used and only formally identified in 1972 on the basis of an ILO report in Kenya, the understanding has dawned that this is too broad a term, and we should really actually talk about something which is more focused on the informal economy. The reasons for that, in short, appears from this very slide, which I'm not going to talk about more in detail. But it brings us to the more or less general understanding, and I wouldn't want to say this is a definition, but at least an understanding of what we mean by the sector. The consensus appears to emphasize that from a legal perspective, informality encapsulates those activities falling de facto, in other words, factually, practically, concretely, or de jure, legally, out of the realm of law. So effectively, these are the people who are not covered. Most of them work as informal workers informally, so to say. Some of them may even work in the formal sector, but informally so, and are not sufficiently protected. Right, the details you can read at a later stage. Even at the level of the international standards framework, and in this regard largely directed, if not dictated, by the very influential ICLS, that is the International Conference on Labour Statisticians. It's under the guidance of the ILO, get together every few years. Even they have moved the stance about who these people are from looking at enterprises in the first place. Said, no, this is not right. We have to look at it from an employment-based definition perspective. So let me quote again. Instead of focusing on the formality of the enterprise, an employment-based definition defines informality in relation to the employment characteristics of the individual. According to this approach, individuals are considered to be in informal employment if their employment relationship is in law or in practice, as I said, not subject to national labour legislation, income taxation, social protection, or entitlement to certain employment benefits, and the like, unquote. And then in 2013, the previous, there was a recent ICLS in October, but the previous one, the 19th ICLS, came up with this definition of work. Listen carefully. Work is now officially defined in the world as being irrespective of its formal or informal character, or even the legality of the activity. I think this is a breakthrough. It's a breakthrough from a legal perspective, but also otherwise. At least what this new definition does is to tell us that we are and we have to mainstream people who work in the informal economy. They're not just a group out there. They must be officially made part of a framework, legal and policy and other framework in the country that will take proper care of them. That is the main message, mainstreaming, in my view. The current debate in labour law. Labour lawyers all over the world have been debating this for the last 3-4 decades. What are the frontiers, the scope? What is the scope of labour law? And so the realization that perhaps we should no longer talk about labour law, but the law of work. These kind of voices we hear. Very difficult issue. And then in the area of occupational health and safety legislation, the new laws that we find in many countries have actually realized this. A work and a workplace is no longer the traditional concept. We look at the expansive notion of what is work, who is a worker, and what is a workplace. We don't have time now to go into details. Informal employment has also been interpreted widely. Now, I'm not going to read through this definition, we have really got a time problem, but you can just see the different categories already covered in this definition adopted by the European Commission a few years ago of even people in wage employment who may be working informally, but also others, the so-called self-employed. And even so, if you stand back and look at this kind of definition, you have to ask yourself, but even so, is this really sufficiently comprehensive? What about our care economy workers, mentioned in one of the speeches earlier today? Surely they are also in the formal economy. They're not paid, but they're workers. What about those who work in so-called supply chains? You know, those who manufacture Nike shoes for us. It's a whole line of different people at different levels, all giving their inputs. And the one wouldn't know about the other. They all work. They may have a specific provider of work. How will we determine social security responsibility in a supply chain context? You can see the complexity, and yet it is not impossible. Right. Domestic legal systems, very few countries that I know of have tried to give a legal definition to this, so we need to work on this. But let me give you two examples. The one is Tanzania. The Tanzanian Social Security Regulatory Authority Act defines, and I quote, the informal sector as a sector that includes workers who work informally and who do not work in terms of an employment contract or another contract contemplated in the definition of employee in the Act. Very broad, but there you have it. And then if you go to India, you'll probably find, what shall we call it? Country with the largest range of measures and attempts to cover those in the informal economy. And the most recent attempt, not yet law, but on the way to become law, is now called the 2018 Draft Labour Code on Social Security and Welfare. And if you only were to go to the definition section and see what India is now trying to do to define these various categories, I've just isolated a few of the issues for you. They define in this particular draft law the broad concept of worker asset, including both an employee where wages have to be paid, but also a so-called non-employee, comprising of what they call owner cum worker, person or a self-employed worker, in themselves definitions of a wide nature being given. Then an unorganized sector is then defined as an establishment which employ workers, and the number of such workers is less than the threshold, which the old ILO labor statisticians definition. B, self-employed units, and C, households that employ domestic workers for carrying out the activities of the household. Now, the interesting thing about India, let me say it now if we don't get to that later on due to time. What the code then does, this particular code, very interesting. It uses all of these concepts and say, okay, now, how are we going to provide for social security in financial terms for them? Okay. Let's categorize them according to income levels and, of course, the category in which they fall. If they fall in this non-employee category, particular, and their income is below a certain threshold at the very bottom, we assume that they can't contribute. It's not all of the informal economy workers, but many of them. And for them, and this is important news, the government of India commits itself to pay a contribution on their behalf to, I'm talking about contributory systems. I'm not talking for the moment about non-contributory possibilities, which are also there. I'll come back to that. Very interesting. And I want to say to you today that there are quite a few examples now in the world where governments understand that for at least many, if not most, of the informal economy workers, they need to provide also on a contributory basis. Also, the attempt here to extend the NPF to be established to cover the informal economy workers. But what governments in the world are really doing at this stage is to realize that for some workers who cannot make a contribution, if you want to cover them on a contributory system, those contributions must come from government or from a welfare fund, which is also a possibility. Right. let's continue. Okay, so what are some of our conclusions? We have seen some evolution in the definitional terms. Focus are now on workers not covered by the current legal system, whether legally or factually. And informal employment and formal workers deliberately are defined in wide terms to capture the range of those involved in the informal economy. And yet the final issue there, despite the developments indicated above, there is little consistency, especially at national level, how these terms are defined. So complexity of definition doesn't mean that we are not going to cover them. It just tells us it's a difficult task. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't really have time to cover this, but one of the problems, of course, it's the borderlines are blurred. People move between formal and informal. Maybe not so much in this country, but in many other countries. So the borderlines. And if we had time, I would have explained to you about recent studies undertaken to indicate how careful we have to be with just assuming, for example, that all of those in the formal economy just are not able to do anything to make their own contributions. Studies in Africa, West African capital cities, for example, have said, no, there are different categories, and certainly certain categories are able to do this job. Demographic framework, very briefly. In its recently published global overview of the magnitude of the informal economy, the ILO, it's a 2018 publication, indicates that 2 billion of the world's employed population, aged 15 and over, work informally. 61.2% of global employment. So what is the evidence here? Among the 5 main reasons, the vast majority of employment in Africa, look at the figure, 85.8% is informal. And then it gives us the breakdown of the other regions. But Africa by far is the most severe problem. The proportion of informal employment in Northern Africa is 67.3%, and yet in our part of the world, a staggering 89.2%. It raises significant in agriculture, 97.9%. We talk about the majority of our people who work. They should receive our priority attention too, isn't it? So who in particular are affected? Women, the young, the old, those with no education and living in rural areas. I'm summarizing what the ILO report says. And then the reasons. We heard this morning about the reasons. And I'm not going to add to that other than to say that the skewed nature of labour markets in Africa, largely brought about as a result of the colonial period, is one of the main factors that led to the situation that we have today. Right. Limited access. Let me just run through a few of this issue. That the current regime, both internationally and also domestically, very often does not fit the picture of those who work informally. The standards classical risks that we know of and that's so important, provided for in conventions, for example, not just of the ILO but others as well, not all of those risks are, or there are also other risks which are relevant for people who work in the informal economy. Some of these risks are collective in nature. We heard this morning about disasters, etc. Perhaps the greatest risk of all is just plain poverty. And our conventional model does not fit these risks. Right. Of course, the new recommendations 202, but in particular 204, really try to now provide at least a framework for dealing with the informal economy. In national systems, what do we find? Our contributory systems of social security, our pension funds, even our health insurance generally, they cover those who work in an employment relationship, the formal relationship. The definition excluding others, unless you develop specialized regimes to cover them, or you institute, as some countries doing, even in Africa, you introduce universal insurance schemes, universal health insurance. Rwanda, Kenya, very good examples, can be done. What about social assistance, non-contributory? This country is increasingly an exception. But in most of our countries, even in South Africa where I come from, our social systems is, even though it covers 1/3 of the South African population, is category-based. You have to be young enough, old enough, or disabled enough to qualify. Otherwise, you're outside. So traditional social assistance does not provide for the people we are talking of. Again, we have to have a fresh look, even from a social assistance perspective, how we cover these people. Okay. Right. Now, let's look at the human rights instruments. Well, I'm not going to talk too much about it. So much was already said. Interesting, this new recommendation of the ILO 2004, paragraph 18, quote, countries should progressively extend in law and in practice to all workers in the informal economy, social security, maternity protection, decent working conditions, and a minimum wage, unquote. Speaks for itself. The AU level, very important developments. Is already, and I know tomorrow Professor Straden will talk more about the AU framework, but there is this important document called Spire Work, and there are also other instruments, as you will hear tomorrow. There's the AU social policy framework, and then the two new draft instruments, which are actually on their way for validation. The new draft protocol on the rights of citizens to social protection, social security, and also the new draft social agenda 2063. Both of these instruments talk directly to the position and the coverage of people in the informal economy. At the SADC level, there are also several instruments. The code mentioned earlier today, the Conceptual Charter, and even the new 2014 Protocol on Employment and Labour, specific provisions to make it clear that states should extend protection to those in the informal economy, in particular through innovative mechanisms. Okay, I'm not going to quote this. Constitutional protection is interesting. If I had time, I would have tried to explain to you what's happening in South Africa, where the strong constitutional impact has really affected this particular terrain, and for the good of it as well. But maybe we have another South African here, maybe she can talk about that, Dr. Fourie. So what has happened in the world? Conceptual and regulatory extension. India, I said, is the birthplace of so many attempts to do this. On the one hand, we have this all over or universal basis of extension. The current act, which is not well enforced, the 2008 one, but now the new Labour Code and Social Security and Welfare that I mentioned earlier. On the other hand, India has also industry programs. For example, in the beading industry and the construction industry, what they do is to set up welfare funds for this industry, being funded in different ways, which I don't have time to explain to you now. And out of these welfare funds, they provide support to informal economy workers. Domestic workers in South Africa, for example, there was a deliberate and very successful attempt to extend bit by bit, piece by piece, the current labour laws with social security implications also to domestic workers. Right. So, institutional initiatives. There are just so many. I've tried to classify them. And let me just run through them, and the details you can read for yourself. The first is the extension of the reach of social assistance arrangements or non-contributory arrangements. I listened with interest this morning what the Honourable Minister said about the basic income grant. So that is a perfect example of this. But let me also just mention Brazil and Mexico. What they've done is to develop broad-based social assistance arrangements. The Bolsa Familia in Brazil, for example, and the Oportunidades scheme in Mexico, that cover at a very broad basis poor people in those countries, irrespective of whether they're unemployed or work in the informal sector. So there are ways to do this. Then secondly, extending existing schemes. I mentioned South Africa. Latin America, interesting. Some Latin American countries are now doing this even on a compulsory basis. And they use incentives as a way to prompt people in the informal economy to participate. And look at the remark at the end by this world-renowned scholar, Misalago, who comes from Latin America, saying that a few Latin American countries that require compulsory membership generally have better and more effective coverage. Embracing the whole of the informal economy. So we have seen in different countries attempts to say, let's look at the informal economy as a whole. I mentioned India already, Indonesia, with its 2004 law, really mainstreamed in this regard the informal economy, made it part legally also of how we cover the informal economy. China, just look at the massive scale at how they did this. They introduced programs, universal programs, contributory and non-contributory. Even in the contributory side, 2 new health insurance programs covering already in 2009 1.2 billion out of 1.3 billion nationals. Right. Indonesia, health insurance extension. Thailand, also perhaps the best example in the developing world of introducing universal health insurance, covering all workers. In Ghana, we have seen a very interesting attempt to introduce and establish a Ghana informal sector fund, tailor-made for the context and the needs of people who work in the informal economy in that country. Other countries have said, or they may have in addition, not a universal approach, but a sector-by-sector approach. I talked about domestic workers in South Africa, Sri Lanka schemes for fishers and for farmers. Talk about India already. Tunisia, probably the best example in this continent of a sector-by-sector coverage of those who work in the informal economy. And they've done so gradually, perhaps the oldest framework in Africa as far as this is concerned. Usually very, not just very comprehensive, but very successful. Sat down with different sectors in the informal economy, said, what are your needs, how can we cover you, etc., etc. It's really a case study to be studied. Right, and the Philippines have now done the same. There you find the details. Even in Tanzania. Kinship mutuality-based arrangement, I'm not only going to give you one example, and that is the well-known SEBA, the Self-Employed Women's Association of India. It's an informal association of informal female workers. They now count, well, latest count ourselves 1.33 million members. They've grown so strong in membership that they have become very influential, policy-wise even in India, and be able to negotiate on behalf of their membership for social insurance arrangements with companies, health insurance, etc. So you can do it if you can able to do it at scale. Let me skip this, and this is important. One of the restrictions that we find, and I don't think Namibia is an exception, is that our laws very often restrict the coverage of, participation of, and the representation of informal economy workers. Look at your definition of employee in the Social Security Act and you'll understand what I say. People working in the informal sector, informal economy in this country would have to, they could do register voluntary and then they have to pay a double contribution. You're not going to attract members on that basis. You need a new definition. Or look at the Labour Act and this applies even in South Africa, who's an employee or a trade union is representing employees in the formal sector. In this way, we are not allowing trade unions to represent informal economy workers. Now, India has understood the message and they've already changed their definition a long time ago. So I'm reminded of the little time we had. So flexible modalities important, flexible contribution modalities. You can't expect of informal workers, most of them, many of them, to contribute regularly, because many of them don't have a regular income. Okay. So that's contribution modalities. Has to be flexible. Flexible design features. Think of a pension regime. Normally, if you want to qualify for a pension, you have to make regular contributions over a 25, 30-year period. Can't work for most informal economy workers. Again, you have to adapt your design features and eventually also your benefit regimes. What are the benefits that we make available to people who work in the formal economy? Only the traditional range of benefits. They have their own specific needs. Right. And most important, how do we do this? Consultation. In countries with the most extensive extension of social protection for the informal economy workers, one example in Africa, Ghana, and one example in Asia, India. They have done so on the basis of sending in high-profile committees or commission. In the case of Ghana, it was a presidential commission that literally went into the country, on the countryside, and talked to the very people and understand what the real needs are. And in India, it's a high-level cabinet-appointed committee, the NCEUS. This is all. Communication, enabling framework. not penalize people who work on the streets because they don't apply with city municipal laws, but opening up access to markets to credit is part of the message. So ladies and gentlemen, let me try and draw a few conclusions. I know it's already indicated to me we have almost no time left. We have seen significant developments and expansion. I think there's a new appreciation also in this continent of governments now appreciate the responsibility that they have. But it's also the responsibility of the other stakeholders. It's a need to address the lack of legal foundations. I've talked about some of this. The importance of the most recent ILO recommendation, tailor-made and informal worker-dedicated contribution and benefit modalities, as well as entitlement conditions. I found a remark as the following. The establishment of the ILO almost 100 years ago was a direct response to the need to provide standards for the regulation of the employment relationship. The world of work has moved. We are soon celebrating 100 years of the ILO's existence. The emphasis then, therefore, or then 100 years ago on the so-called demodification of labor, repeated when the ILO was re-established after World War II, has acquired a new meaning in the wake of changes to the world of work, work relationships, and the labor market. Let us heed this call to work towards, both as international organization, development partners, social partners, and other stakeholders, and in particular governments, to put all our effort in extending social protection meaningfully to the majority of our people who work in this continent, the informal workers. I thank you.
I just want to find out from your experience, the countries that do have an explicit provision in the constitution for social security as a right, if it's entrenched in the constitution, how does it help in the extension of comprehensive social protection to all, in comparison with countries that do not have that explicit provision in their constitutions?
One of the things of one of the processes of way that has been abused in the way of consultation, where policymakers will come, just consult you, and when they go back, they do what they want to do, and use the word they are consulted. Would it be the best idea that the process of formulation of such kind of policies or anything includes the players themselves, other than just being consulted, but being included in the policy formulation process? What would you say?
I have one question, because I think one of the biggest challenges in Africa is sustainability of social protection programs, or financing of social protection programs. Prof, I want to hear your views on what are the best possible mechanisms to financially support and sustain through domestic resources social protection programs. Thank you.
Let me start with the first one, the constitutional provisions. I think in short the answer is yes. And I can speak of the South African Constitution, which has an explicit constitutional right to access social security for everyone, including if they're unable to support themselves, right to appropriate social assistance. There's a general tenor in the constitutional judgment. I say general tenor in the first place that you could really see that what the Constitutional Court has been saying since its inception in 94, 95, is to say that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, this is part of the Bill of Rights, this provision, is there in the first place to take care of the poor and the vulnerable, those who were excluded under the previous regime. So that's a starting point. Secondly, in its interpretation on this, the few cases we have had a constitutional interpretation of the right to access to security, the kind of pronouncements, for example, in the case where the Constitutional Court extended social assistance to permanent residents. If you look at the pronouncements made by the court in terms of what is meant by social assistance, for whom is it, and the court made it very clear, in essence, there isn't and shouldn't be distinctions, and if there are distinctions, they should be well motivated. Now, this was not the case about the informal economy workers, but that's a tenor. And then thirdly, we have seen in the labor law era. So, for example, the Section 23 of the Constitution dealing with, amongst others, every person has a right to fair labor practices. Initially, the court in the Constitutional Court interpreted this only for workers in the formal employment relationship. But about the last 2 years, there have been a number of judgments to say, no, this worker concept is a much broader concept for that purpose. So I think the answer is yes. There's a colleague from Zambia. Of course, I agree with you. And I think if you were to analyze what happened in India, you'll probably find this. But equally important, in addition to the formulation, once you have something on the table, then you need to go back and share it with those who are affected for their inputs. And the interesting thing to me is how the Indian government, their Ministry of Labour currently is doing this with this new draft code. They actually literally go all over the country, and they have these huge gatherings where they share this code and try to explain this. Right, the third question is a much broader question asked by our colleague Ilma. Financial support, because it goes beyond just the informal economy, but certainly African countries have found innovative ways to grow domestic, what shall we call it, financial resources. The one way in some countries where you have extractive resources, they've established what do you call it, mineral wealth funds. It's one example. Redirecting budgetary allocations, making sure that we meet the standard set, and the standard set is much higher. We'll probably hear tomorrow a little more about it. It's much higher by African Union than currently what most of our countries are doing. And in fact, and hopefully tomorrow I could ask my colleague to talk to this. There's a whole new framework that the African Union has developed in terms of domestic resource mobilization, which serves as a good guiding framework for all African governments as to how to raise domestic resource allocation, also then for social protection. Sorry, this is all that we have time for. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Sorry that I missed this. I would really want to listen to everybody. Thank you.